about the economy has increased a lot. And now we see a lot of solar panel, we see a lot of green technology going on in many countries. And we think this kind of care effect, this kind of increasing care effect is also important. So ultimately, we think that this policy will bring the development of green technology, and this will ultimately bring a sustainable development. Because green technology, the main reason people do not like green technology is because it's not efficient. However, if corporations and people care and invest a lot of money and try to develop them, then this green technology will be developed and will not cost much as technology develops compared to the conventional source of energy, which is oil. So we think that ultimate benefit of green technology development, and we will use it, and we will also save the environment, and economic problem will be solved ultimately. So because of this ultimate benefit and the solvency reason, the government do think immediate need call for immediate action, and the positive balance is the way to go. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 20 seconds.
Right, we thank the speaker for his speech and invite now the second speaker of opposition, the deputy leader of opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The problem with the entire opening government is that they say that environment is problematic for the entire 40 minutes. We understand the problem of environment to a certain extent. But what we propose to you on the opening opposition is a balanced approach, ladies and gentlemen. We acknowledge environment is important, but at the same time, economy is also important, which is vital for the survival in developing nations. Consider the fact, for example, in the case of Africa, where one child is dying every 3 seconds. This urgent problem can be solved as well. We don't think just environment, Western colonization, another form of imposement can be enough a reason to ignore the sovereign right of these nations at the end of the day. That's why we oppose. Based on this theme, I'm going to take you 2 levels of constructives. First of all, I'm going to further extend analysis of how sovereign right to balance between economy and environment is important, besides my partner analysis of how this is unfair. Second, I'm going to explain how this is not fit the criteria of binding or sanction, which is a radical case represented by opening government. But before that, I have 3 rebuttals toward opening government. First of all, they said that we're not doing anything to cope with the environmental problem, so that's problematic. You should be reading the news, ladies and gentlemen. For example, COP10 and COP20, there has been consensus to have a lower emission already under the current paradigm. For example, Japanese Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Hatoyama explicitly said we should be decreasing the amount of CO2 by 25%. Developing nations also made a first consensus to decrease to a certain extent. No, thank you. These kind of things already being done under the current paradigm. 2, we are trying to cope with this problem to maximum extent. For example, in case of official development assistance, we're trying to give enough technology for these countries. For example, like Japan's ODA for China, 96% of them are targeted toward coping with environment. So the West is doing absolutely nothing. It's ridiculous in the first place. And this environment we are tackling to a certain extent. Second of all, this idea, it's everyone's problem. Ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen, because the West is the one who's responsible for the current environmental problem, ladies and gentlemen. Because after all, for example, Industrial Revolution or the Japan's rapid economic growth, which we see in later 20th century, that's how much we polluted the air, polluted the environment, and polluted the soil at the end of the day. Developing nations, meanwhile, had nothing to do with that, ladies and gentlemen. So saying that everyone's problem is simply a ridiculous rhetoric. No, thank you. Third, what they have said this is going to increase the level of green technology. One, we already doing that to a certain extent. Japanese Prime Minister, current Prime Minister Noda is, for example, subsidizing certain developing certain subsidies or in the current paradigm. Obama has explicitly said he will invest in green industry for the past. So we are already doing it. The uniqueness of binding is still lacking from the opening government. Hopefully the member will come up with a better answer. Sit down. So second of all, let's explain about why sovereign right to balance between economy and environment is important. I have 3 reasons why sovereign right should be respected. First of all, sovereign right is important because it's a representation of the will of the citizens, ladies and gentlemen. Because the citizens of the country are the ones who's most affected. And for the citizens' first priority is economy, ladies and gentlemen. For example, in case of very developing nations, where people are are living behind poverty line and are unable to go to school, unable to go to hospitals, and unable to go to starving to death daily, we think that is problematic. When their sons or daughters are suffering to death, when their family members are unable to have more spread, that's the problem, that's the representation will of these countries. Second, it's simply unfair for developed nations, right? They say we are going to minimize the harm somehow. How can you then they have a very so low bar, ladies and gentlemen, because according to their logic, we have to take radical action. Just how we want to balance it. It's such a going to be such a low emission, as Kazushika has already pointed out to you. So I don't know what you're trying to achieve with soft, ridiculously stance. No, thank you. So this is simply developed nations is going to decide this much emission has to be done by the United Nations. This is going to be imposing that value, ladies and gentlemen. We can never impose any values in the past. For example, in the case of ILO, International Labour Organization. Even though certain countries are part of International Labour Organization, such as Japan and Africa, even though it just criticizes country, you can never impose and stop those things. In case of International Whale Commission of decreasing the whale consumption, we can never impose Japan and Australia, right? In case of Kyoto Protocol, even though environment is important, we never impose those values, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't think their analysis even stands. Third of all, more importantly, the situation differs from country to country, ladies and gentlemen. Even though decreasing emission is good for advanced nations because they have more capability, right? Overseas because people, yes, some people are poor, but that's like so relatively small population, at least much better compared to developing nation, right? The situation is much better. They have a capability there. But in case of developing nation, especially when there's scarce resources, you have to allocate that money to people on the ground. You cannot make the simple overgeneralization. The environment is always an absolute value. Closing.
The problem that we see is that politicians keep explicitly saying they're going to do this, going to do that. Explain to us how your non-binding treaty is going to ensure they follow through on their words.
You don't have the burden of proof. The burden of proof explains the balance between economy and environment. Come back to the debate for once. So third of all, let's take a look at the criteria of binding, ladies and gentlemen. They said we have to make it binding. We have to sanction, right? The economic sanction, that's ridiculous, right? Because criteria of sanction is where it shocks everyone's conscience of humanity by any means, such as massacre or genocide. THBT, for example, freezing the assets in Libya, or how we sanction Syria by EU, Japan, United States, and most recently by Turkey, ladies and gentlemen. And there has to be clear intent and action to deprive fundamental human rights of everyone, ladies and gentlemen, because that is their policy, right? But in case of pollution environment, what is it? This is not merely a selfish act, Madam, Mr. Speaker. This is an intent to help the people on the ground by representing people's will on the ground, where it lacks of education or pension or hospitals or livelihood protection, where people behind living poverty line. That's why I gave the example of Africa before, where one death occurs every 3 seconds. Then they said we can still work to have economic prosperity. How? Ladies and gentlemen, because the reason why these countries are able to develop is by inviting multinational companies and by allocating the cost from rather than cost on the regulation, but allocating that toward, for example, employment, ladies and gentlemen. Because it costs quite a lot, for example, to have this higher standard of obligation, right? That's why they have to, but that's why they cannot hire that many people, ladies and gentlemen. And if we take this proposal, since there has to be even higher standard, you're unable to use that money for employment, ladies and gentlemen, where people have to simply suffer, ladies and gentlemen, because these people have power to empower, they cannot use that money to buy more spread. Moreover, since it's much, much difficult to have a lower price created at the end of the day, this decreases export at the end of the day. So it harms the environment. So ladies and gentlemen, we need to take a balanced approach.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 23 seconds.
Right, we thank the speaker for his speech and now invite the first speaker from closing government.
You have a serious problem with the position of side opposition because they already made the concession that they agree environmental initiatives are good, Mr. Speaker, but they refuse to accept the one thing that will strengthen these environmental initiatives and make them strong, which is the binding element. And not only the binding element, but the binding element on target, Mr. Speaker. This is the very crux of the closing case, the element of target and why they're important. Because fundamentally, this is our unique extension. That target give clarity and why this clarity is important for the success of these international agreements, Ms. Speaker, and the environmental movement, especially at the grassroots level. I'm going to tell you fundamentally on three levels why targets will oblige these nations to take positions, clear positions, Ms. Speaker. And second of all, I'm going to tell you as well how this clarity is important for the citizens of these nations, especially since it's the citizens who do the polluting, Ms. Speaker. But before we get on to that, let's deal with the case of side opposition, because fundamentally they keep telling us they agree, but they've decided to hide in this pocket of these poor countries. They refuse to engage on the element of, for those who are in agreement to these initiatives, such as the Kyoto Protocol or such as the Copenhagen Initiative. If those individuals agree fundamentally, then why shouldn't we go the extra step of these binding targets, Ms. Speaker? What is necessarily inherently bad about setting binding targets? And we want that engagement from side opposition, because the only thing they told us is that there are certain nations, third world nations, who are too poor and cannot afford to be part of this system, Ms. Speaker, and poverty is a priority to them over these environmental initiatives. We don't believe that's particularly true, because you see the effects already. The reason why some of these nations are poor, for example, is because of drought. We see even in Thailand with the flooding in Thailand, some of the flooding in Europe, even though this may not be directly linked to global warming, but these are some of the effects that are similar to global warming. And we believe if we allow the environment to move towards it, it will cause worse detriments, and it will bring worse poverty, and it will destroy, it will devastate and exacerbate the situation in the third world. So we believe that's why the imperative is there for the third world to want to join up in these initiatives. And more so, we believe if it's an element of money, we believe if we set binding targets, then it will oblige the first world nations to, if they tell these third world nations, here's a binding target that you have to follow, then they have to support these third world